The bitter winds of December 1776 carried more than winter's chill across the frozen Delaware River. They carried the dying breath of a revolution that seemed destined for failure. General George Washington stood on the Pennsylvania shore, his weathered hands gripping the rails of a makeshift ferry as ice chunks crashed against the hull like the broken dreams of 13 colonies. Behind him, the remnants of the Continental Army huddled in threadbare uniforms, their feet leaving bloody trails in the snow where boots had long since worn through. The situation could not have been more desperate. British forces under General William Howe controlled New York, while Hessian mercenaries had established winter quarters throughout New Jersey. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, and enlistments were set to expire on December 3rd. Washington knew that, without a dramatic victory, the cause of American independence would die with the old year. The surprise attack on Trenton on December 6th had provided a glimmer of hope, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers and boosting Patriot morale. But as Washington's intelligence network reported, British reinforcements under General Charles Cornwallis were marching south with 8,000 men to crush the rebellion once and for all. The American commander faced an impossible choice: retreat across the Delaware again and watch his army dissolve, or make one final desperate gamble that could either secure independence or end the revolution in catastrophic defeat. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Washington's Crossing, the strategic situation in early January 1777 represented the absolute nadir of American fortunes in the Revolutionary War. The British believed they had the colonial rebels trapped, with Cornwallis reportedly telling his officers that he would bag the fox. At daybreak on January 3rd, Washington convened his war council on the evening of January 2nd in a cramped tavern in Trenton. The firelight flickered across the faces of men who had already sacrificed everything for liberty. General Nathanael Greene's tactical brilliance had saved the army in the Southern campaigns. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, whose artillery had proven decisive at Trenton, and General Hugh Mercer, the Scottish physician-turned-warrior whose loyalty to Washington was absolute. The debate was intense, but brief. Some officers advocated for another crossing of the Delaware, arguing that discretion was the better part of valor. Others, led by Greene, proposed a bold flanking maneuver that would take the army around Cornwallis and strike at the British garrison at Princeton, cutting enemy supply lines and potentially opening the road to New Brunswick, where the British had stored vast quantities of military supplies and gold. Washington listened in silence, weighing options that all seemed to lead to either retreat or annihilation. Outside, the temperature was dropping below freezing, and his soldiers were building campfires from fence rails, their faces hollow with hunger and exhaustion. Many had not been paid in months, and their families back home faced starvation and British reprisals. The decision, when it came, would define not just the immediate future of the Continental Army, but the very possibility of American nationhood. Washington rose from the table, his tall frame casting long shadows in the candlelight, spoke the words that would echo through history. "Gentlemen, we march at midnight. We shall either find glory at Princeton, or we shall find our graves. But we shall not find surrender." The die was cast. In less than 12 hours, a ragtag army of farmers and merchants would attempt something that professional military minds deemed impossible: a night march in sub-zero temperatures followed by a dawn assault on a fortified position held by some of Britain's finest regiments. The column began moving at exactly midnight on January 3rd, 1777, with Washington personally leading the advance guard through the frozen New Jersey countryside. The temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. The rutted roads were treacherous with ice that cracked like gunshots beneath wagon wheels and horses' hooves. Behind the general, 2,400 Continental soldiers in Pennsylvania, militia moved like ghosts through the darkness, their breath forming white clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. The march route Washington had chosen was audacious in its complexity, a wide arc around Cornwallis's sleeping army that would bring the Americans to Princeton from the northeast, completely bypassing British expectations. The general had divided his force into two columns. The main body under his personal command would take the longer Quaker Road, while a smaller diversionary force under General Hugh Mercer would approach Princeton via the shorter back road, creating confusion about American intentions and numbers. Every step of the 18-mile march was fraught with mortal danger. British and Hessian patrols regularly swept the countryside, and a single musket shot or the neigh of a startled horse could bring enemy cavalry thundering down upon the exposed column. Washington had issued strict orders: no talking above a whisper, no smoking, no stopping, except on his direct command. Men who fell behind were to be left behind. The mission was too important to risk for individual lives. The physical toll was extraordinary. Soldiers wrapped their feet in strips of cloth torn from blankets, leaving red stains in the snow where frostbitten flesh had split open. Horses stumbled and fell on the icy roads, their riders forced to continue on foot. Artillery pieces had to be manhandled around fallen trees and through creek beds where bridges had been destroyed by British engineers. Colonel Alexander Hamilton's battery, which had performed so brilliantly at Trenton, found their cannon wheels constantly jamming with ice that had to be chipped away with bayonets and ramrods. As documented in William Stryker's detailed military history, the battles of Trenton and Princeton
The logistical challenges of this night march
were so severe that many professional officers considered Washington's plan essentially suicidal. The British had every reason to believe that colonial forces would remain in their defensive positions around Trenton, waiting for the inevitable assault that Cornwallis would launch at dawn. By 4 a.m, advance scouts reported that they had successfully circled around the British Army and were approaching Princeton from the northeast. The town lay sleeping in the pre-dawn darkness, its streets empty except for sentries who huddled around braziers for warmth. The British garrison consisted of 3 regiments: the 17th Foot, the 40th Foot, and the 55th Foot, totaling approximately 1,200 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mulhood. Washington called a brief halt to reorganize his forces and review the attack plan one final time. The men formed into battle lines with practiced efficiency, despite their exhaustion and the numbing cold, or General Mercer's column would strike. First, engaging enemy outposts and drawing attention. While Washington's main force would sweep into the town from multiple directions, preventing organized resistance and capturing the British before they could form defensive squares, the general moved among his troops in those final moments before battle, his presence alone worth a regiment of reinforcements. These men had followed him through defeats at Long Island and White Plains, through the desperate retreat across New Jersey, through the triumph at Trenton. They had seen him share their hardships, sleeping on frozen ground, and eating the same meager rations. When Washington spoke to them now, his words were simple but electric. Today we fight not just for victory, but for the right of free men everywhere to govern themselves. As the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of gray, marking the approach of January 3rd's dawn, the Continental Army prepared to launch an attack that would determine whether the United States of America would live or die in its infancy. Dawn broke cold and clear over Princeton on January 3rd, 1777. As General Hugh Mercer's advance column approached the town along the back road, the Scottish-born physician turned soldier had served with Washington in the French and Indian War, and their friendship ran deeper than military protocol. Mercer understood that this battle would either vindicate his commander's desperate strategy or see them both buried in New Jersey soil before noon. At 7:30 in the morning, Mercer's 350 men encountered the first British resistance near the Quaker Meeting House. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mulhood, commanding the British garrison, had been preparing to march south, with 2 regiments to reinforce Cornwallis when his scouts reported American forces approaching from an unexpected direction. Mulhood was a veteran officer who had spent 15 years fighting Britain's enemies across the globe, and he immediately grasped both the opportunity and the danger if he could crush this colonial force quickly. He would win promotion and glory, but if he allowed them to reach Princeton's streets, the day might be lost. The initial engagement erupted with the sharp crack of musketry as British light infantry opened fire from behind stone walls and farm buildings. Mercer's men, many of them Pennsylvania riflemen whose accuracy was legendary, responded with aimed shots that dropped redcoats where they stood. But the British had numerical superiority and better positions. And within minutes, the American advance began to falter under withering volleys from disciplined ranks of professional soldiers. Mercer himself led a desperate charge across an open field that would forever bear his name, his sword raised high as he shouted encouragement to his men. The sight of their general advancing into the teeth of British fire galvanized the Americans, who surged forward with bayonets fixed and voices raised in a wild yell that echoed across the frozen landscape. For a moment, it seemed the charge might succeed. British ranks wavered as colonial steel met British steel in hand-to-hand combat that showed no quarter on either side. But professional training and superior numbers began to tell. British cavalry, held in reserve behind a ridge, suddenly appeared on Mercer's flank, with sabers gleaming in the morning sun. The 17th Light Dragoons struck the American line. Like a thunderbolt, their horses trampling men who had no time to form defensive squares. In the chaos that followed, General Mercer found himself surrounded by enemy soldiers, his horse shot from under him, and his sword broken at the hilt, as chronicled in Thomas Fleming's authoritative account, The Winter Soldiers. The wounding of General Mercer became one of the war's most poignant moments, symbolizing both the sacrifice required for independence and the brutal reality of 18th century warfare. British soldiers, believing they faced the despised Washington himself, bayoneted the fallen general repeatedly, leaving him mortally wounded in the bloody snow of the field that would memorialize his name. The sight of their beloved general falling sent shockwaves through the American ranks. Men who had advanced with such courage moments before now began falling back in disorder, some throwing down their muskets in panic as British cavalry pursued them across the open ground. The retreat threatened to become a rout that would shatter Washington's entire army before the main attack could even begin. It was at this critical moment that Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery came thundering across the field, their horses lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Hamilton, only 22 years old, but already recognized as one of the war's most capable officers, unlimbered his guns within canister range of the British cavalry and opened fire with devastating effect. The first discharge emptied a dozen saddles and sent the surviving dragoons reeling back in confusion, but the damage had been done. Mercer's column was shattered, its survivors streaming back toward the main American force with news that the British were not only alert but actively counterattacking. Mahood, sensing complete victory within his grasp, began deploying his full force for a general advance that would crush Washington's army against the frozen countryside like grain beneath a millstone. As the sound of battle echoed across the winter landscape, Washington himself appeared on the field, his presence immediately recognizable to friend and foe alike. The next few minutes would determine whether the American Revolution would continue or die. In the snow-covered fields outside Princeton, New Jersey, the thunderous roar of British artillery echoed across the frozen battlefield as General George Washington spurred his white charger toward the sound of combat. Behind him, the main body of the Continental Army was deploying from column into battle line. But the process was agonizingly slow, as men struggled with numb fingers to fix bayonets and prime muskets in the bitter cold. Remnants of Mercer's force streaming back in disorder, and he knew that the next few minutes would determine whether American independence lived or died on this snow-covered field. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood had reorganized his British forces with the efficiency of a professional soldier, forming his 800 men into a classic 18th century battle line with the 17th Foot in the center and supporting regiments on either flank. His artillery, commanded by Captain William Scott, unlimbered 6 brass cannons that were already sending solid shot crashing through the American ranks. The British were advancing steadily, their redcoats bright against the white snow, drums beating the march and colors flying proudly in the morning breeze. Washington faced a commander's ultimate test. His exhausted army was outnumbered and caught in the open, facing professional soldiers who had never known defeat. The logical decision would be to order an immediate retreat, preserving what remained of his force for another day. But Washington understood, with the clarity that comes only in moments of supreme crisis, that there would be no other day if he retreated now. The revolution would collapse, the Continental Congress would sue for peace, and 13 colonies would return to British rule with their leaders destined for the gallows. Instead of retreat, Washington made a decision that defied every principle of military science. He would lead a frontal assault against superior numbers in a defensive position, gambling everything on the slim hope that American courage could overcome British professionalism. Wheeling his horse to face his troops, the general drew his sword and raised it high above his head, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield despite the roar of artillery. "Forward, my brave fellows. Show them how Americans can fight." The words were simple, but they electrified men who had followed Washington through 2 years of defeat and desperate retreat. Here was their commander, the man who had shared their hardships and their dangers, asking them to charge into the mouth of British cannons, not for pay or glory, but for the radical idea that free men could govern themselves. The American advance began slowly, then gathered momentum as units that had been wavering suddenly surged forward with renewed determination. On the right flank, General John Sullivan's New Hampshire regiments moved against the British left with the precision of veteran soldiers. In the center, Pennsylvania troops under General Thomas Mifflin advanced through a hail of musket balls that dropped men with every step. On the left, New Jersey militia, who had seen their farms burned and their neighbors imprisoned by British forces, fought with the fury of men defending their homeland, as documented in the detailed battlefield analysis by historian David Hackett Fisher. Washington's personal leadership during the Princeton charge represented one of the war's most crucial moments, when individual courage and force of character proved more decisive than tactical manuals or professional training. The general rode directly behind the advancing line, well within range of British muskets, his conspicuous presence inspiring men to perform beyond their normal capabilities. The tide of battle began to turn when Captain Hamilton's artillery found the range of the British guns, silencing 2 enemy cannons and creating gaps in Mohud's defensive line. American infantry, seeing their opportunity, poured through these openings with bayonets fixed and voices raised in the wild yell that had become their trademark. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along the entire front as colonial farmers and mechanics proved they could match British regulars in the deadly work of close combat. Mohud, recognizing that his position was becoming untenable, attempted to rally his men for a counterattack that might still salvage victory from impending defeat. But his soldiers, many of them seasoned veterans of European campaigns, had never faced an enemy quite like these Americans' men who fought with the desperate courage of those who knew they were battling for their children's future as well as their own lives. The British line began to buckle under relentless American pressure, and what had begun as an orderly withdrawal quickly degenerated into something approaching panic as word spread that Washington himself was leading the enemy charge. The momentum of battle shifted dramatically as Washington's frontal assault began to overwhelm British positions along the entire Princeton line. Lieutenant Colonel Mulhood, watching his carefully organized defensive formation crumble under relentless American pressure, made the agonizing decision that every professional soldier dreads. He ordered a general retreat to prevent the complete destruction of his command. The withdrawal began in good order, with veteran sergeants maintaining discipline, even as colonial bayonets pressed ever closer to British ranks. But retreat in the face of a determined enemy is one of warfare's most dangerous maneuvers. The movement quickly began to deteriorate as individual units lost contact with their commanders. The 17th Foot, which had anchored the British center, found itself cut off from the main body when American riflemen occupied a stone farmhouse that commanded the road to New Brunswick. Captain William Scott's artillery battery, which had performed so effectively in the battle's early stages, was forced to abandon 2 of its cannons when the gun crews were overwhelmed by charging Pennsylvania infantry. Washington, complete victory was within his grasp, pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a chess master moving toward checkmate. He ordered General Sullivan to pursue the retreating British along the main road, while General Greene's column swung wide to cut off any escape toward Trenton. The general himself led a mixed force of Continental infantry and New Jersey militia. In a direct assault on Princeton itself, determined to capture the town before Mahood could organize a defensive stand among its buildings, the assault on Princeton became a running battle through streets that echoed with musket fire and the clash of steel. British soldiers, many of them caught while preparing breakfast or tending to equipment, fought from doorways and windows with the desperation of men who knew that capture meant years in colonial prisons. American forces, their blood heated by the excitement of victory after so many defeats, showed little mercy to enemies who had devastated New Jersey farms and terrorized civilian populations throughout the long retreat from New York. Nassau Hall, the imposing stone building that housed the College of New Jersey, became the focal point of the street fighting. Captain Alexander Hamilton, his artillery pieces positioned in the college yard, sent cannonballs crashing through the building's windows until a white flag appeared from an upper story. The surrender of Nassau Hall marked the effective end of organized British resistance in Princeton, though scattered fighting continued for another hour as die-hard redcoats were routed out of barns and outbuildings. As referenced in William Stryker's comprehensive military study, The Battles of Trenton and Princeton, the capture of Princeton represented far more than a tactical victory. It demonstrated to European observers that American forces could defeat British regulars in open battle, a crucial factor in securing the French alliance that would prove decisive in winning the war. The psychological impact on both armies was equally significant, with British confidence shaken and American morale soaring to heights not seen since the early days of the Revolution. The human cost of victory was sobering. General Hugh Mercer, the beloved Scottish physician who had charged so gallantly across the field that now bore his name, died of his wounds 9 days later, becoming one of the war's most mourned casualties. His sacrifice, however, had not been in vain. His initial assault had delayed the British long enough for Washington's main attack to develop, and his courage had inspired countless Americans to greater efforts in the cause of independence. British casualties were equally severe, with over 200 killed, wounded, or captured out of Mahood's original force of 800. More importantly, the defeat shattered British assumptions about colonial military capabilities and forced a fundamental reassessment of strategy that would influence the remainder of the war. Mahood himself, though he escaped with the remnants of his command, never recovered from the stigma of defeat at the hands of what British propaganda had consistently portrayed as untrained rabble. As Washington surveyed the battlefield in the afternoon of January 3, 1777, he could see the fruits of his desperate gambles scattered across the snow-covered landscape. Princeton was in American hands. British prestige had been shattered, and the Continental Army had proven it could stand against the world's finest professional soldiers. But the general's strategic mind was already looking beyond the immediate tactical success to the broader implications of what had been accomplished in 12 hours of marching and fighting. The capture of Princeton sent shockwaves through British command structures that reverberated from New Jersey to London, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the Revolutionary War. When news of the defeat reached General Charles Cornwallis at Trenton, he immediately abandoned his planned assault on Washington's supposedly trapped army and began a forced march northward to prevent further American advances. The Earl, who had boasted of bagging the fox at dawn, now found himself pursuing an enemy who had outmaneuvered him with audacious brilliance. Washington, however, was far from finished with his winter campaign of miracles. Despite his army's exhaustion after 36 hours of continuous marching and fighting, the general recognized that momentum was a weapon as valuable as artillery. He ordered his forces to press on toward New Brunswick, where British magazines contained supplies worth an estimated 70,000 pounds, enough military equipment to sustain the Continental Army through the coming year and deprive the enemy of resources needed for future campaigns. The march toward New Brunswick became a race against time, with British reinforcements converging from multiple directions to protect their vital supply depot. Cornwallis, stinging from his tactical humiliation, drove his men mercilessly in pursuit of the Americans. while garrisons from Elizabethtown and Perth Amboy received urgent orders to reinforce New Brunswick at all costs. The prize was enormous. Whoever controlled those military stores would hold a decisive advantage in the campaigns to come. But Washington's exhausted soldiers were reaching the limits of human endurance. Many had not slept in 2 days, and their ranks were thinned by frostbite, wounds, and simple collapse from fatigue. As the army approached Kingston, still 6 miles from New Brunswick, alarming reports arrived from scouts. British forces were massing ahead in overwhelming numbers, while Cornwallis was rapidly closing from behind. The trap that Washington had so brilliantly escaped at Trenton was threatening to close again, this time with potentially catastrophic consequences. The decision to halt the advance and withdraw to winter quarters at Morristown was perhaps the most difficult of Washington's military career. Victory at Princeton had opened possibilities that might not come again for years, if ever. The British supply depot at New Brunswick contained not only military equipment, but also the gold necessary to pay his soldiers whose loyalty was increasingly strained by months without wages. More tantalizing still was the possibility of capturing the British war chest and using it to fund American independence. As documented in Joseph Ellis's biographical study, His Excellency, George Washington, the general's decision to consolidate his gains rather than risk everything on one final gamble demonstrated the strategic wisdom that would characterize his entire command. Washington understood that the revolution needed time more than it needed military supplies, time for French aid to materialize, time for American manufacturing to develop, time for British public opinion to turn against an increasingly expensive war. The withdrawal to Morristown was executed with the same skill that had marked the Princeton campaign. Washington divided his army into multiple columns that scattered across the New Jersey countryside, making it impossible for British forces to determine American strength or intentions. The general himself remained with the main body, establishing winter quarters in the Watchung Mountains where terrain favored defense and supply lines remained secure. The strategic consequences of the Princeton victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. News of Washington's success reached European capitals within weeks, carried by merchant ships and diplomatic correspondence that painted a picture of American resilience that surprised seasoned observers. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin found his diplomatic efforts suddenly taken seriously by French officials who had previously viewed American independence as a romantic impossibility. In London, Lord North's government faced unprecedented criticism from parliamentary opposition that questioned both the war's conduct and its ultimate feasibility. Perhaps most significantly, the victory transformed American perceptions of their own military capabilities. The Continental Army that marched into winter quarters at Morristown bore little resemblance to the demoralized rabble that had fled across New Jersey just weeks earlier. These men had proven they could outmarch, outfight, and outthink the world's most professional army. They had seen their commander lead from the front when everything depended on personal courage, and they had witnessed firsthand the power of citizen soldiers fighting for principles larger than themselves. The British, meanwhile, were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their colonial problem had evolved into something approaching a genuine war that might not be won through conventional military means. The ramifications of Princeton echoed through the remaining years of the Revolutionary War and beyond, establishing patterns of leadership and national character that would define American identity for generations. Washington's bold gamble had accomplished something that months of congressional debate and diplomatic correspondence could not achieve. It had proven to the world that the United States of America was more than a collection of rebellious colonies, but a genuine nation worthy of recognition and capable of defending its independence. The immediate military consequences were profound and lasting. British strategy shifted from offensive operations designed to crush rebellion quickly toward defensive measures aimed at holding key ports and population centers. General William Howe, commanding British forces in North America, abandoned plans for aggressive campaigns in 1777 and instead adopted a cautious approach that would ultimately prove fatal to British hopes of military victory. The initiative had passed to American forces, and Washington would exploit that advantage throughout the remainder of the war. Recruitment, which had been desperately slow throughout the dark months of late 1776, suddenly surged as news of Princeton spread through the colonies. Young men who had hesitated to join what seemed a hopeless cause now flocked to Continental Army camps. Inspired by proof that American arms could triumph over professional European soldiers, state militias, which had performed poorly in earlier campaigns, began developing the confidence and cohesion that would make them effective auxiliary forces in battles from Saratoga to Yorktown. The diplomatic revolution was equally significant. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes, who had been cautiously exploring the possibility of American alliance, now began serious negotiations that would culminate in the Franco-American Treaty of 1778. Spanish officials in Madrid, previously skeptical of American prospects, initiated secret discussions about military aid that would eventually prove crucial to Patriot success. Even Prussia's Frederick the Great, Europe's most respected military mind, publicly praised Washington's tactical brilliance and predicted ultimate American victory, as chronicled in Gordon Wood's definitive study, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. Princeton represented more than military victory. It symbolized the emergence of a new kind of warfare in which citizen soldiers, motivated by political ideals rather than professional duty or monetary reward, could defeat armies. Representing centuries of European military tradition, this democratic revolution in military affairs would influence liberation movements worldwide and establish America as a beacon for oppressed peoples everywhere seeking freedom from monarchical rule. The battle's impact on Washington's personal development as a leader cannot be overstated. Princeton proved that the Virginia planter possessed not only the administrative skills necessary for high command, but also the tactical brilliance and personal courage required for battlefield leadership. His decision to lead the charge personally, exposing himself to enemy fire when the battle hung in the balance, created a legend of presidential leadership that would influence American expectations of their chief executives for centuries to come. The transformation of the Continental Army was equally remarkable. The force that had seemed on the verge of dissolution in December 1776 emerged from Princeton as a confidant, professional military organization capable of standing against any enemy. The shared experience of victory under desperate circumstances created bonds among officers and enlisted men that would survive post-war demobilization and provide the nucleus for American political leadership throughout the early national period, perhaps. Most importantly, Princeton established the precedent that American independence was achievable through American effort. The victory demonstrated that colonial forces need not depend entirely on foreign intervention or British political changes to secure their freedom. This self-reliance would become a cornerstone of American national character, influencing everything from westward expansion to 20th century foreign policy. The battlefield itself became hallowed ground almost immediately, veterans returning in later years to walk the fields where they had helped birth a nation. General Hugh Mercer's sacrifice was commemorated with monuments and place names, kept alive the memory of men who had died for principles larger than themselves. Nassau Hall, scarred by Hamilton's cannonballs, became a shrine too educated. Leadership in democratic government. As Washington surveyed the strategic situation in the spring of 1777, he could see that Princeton had accomplished something beyond his most optimistic hopes. The revolution that had seemed destined for failure 3 months earlier was now positioned not merely to survive, but to triumph. The road ahead would be long and costly, with defeats at Brandywine and Germantown testing American resolve. But the foundation for ultimate victory had been laid in the snow-covered fields. Outside a small New Jersey college town, the Battle of Princeton thus stands as one of history's decisive moments, when the course of human events turned on the courage of citizen soldiers and the leadership of a commander who understood that some principles are worth any sacrifice. In 12 hours of marching and fighting, Washington and his Continental Army had transformed the American Revolution from a regional rebellion into a global war for human Freedom, a legacy that continues to inspire oppressed peoples worldwide more than 2 centuries later.